Little Brother Part 3 The War Outside Our Window, 1781. Chapter 9 The Patriots Arrive. March 13th, 1781. Just a little bit more, encouraged Oliver from his position beneath the wagon. Basil gave the wheel a slight turn to the right. Perfect, exclaimed Oliver. Now, hold it right there. The wood vibrated against Basil's hand as Oliver tapped a pin into place. The high-pitched pinging of his hammer against the iron pin echoed from beneath the rig. The boys were completing the installation of the wagon's new front axle. The complicated iron and wood contraption had to be replaced after the original one broke during a recent trip to Salisbury. The Quaker blacksmith and carpenter in Newmarket had worked together to produce an excellent new axle, much superior to the original. However, the piece of equipment had been quite costly. The blacksmith required a payment in trade of 2 calves. Thankfully, the small herd of heifers on the Billingsley farm had birthed 16 calves during the late winter. Because of the importance of a functional wagon, Henry reluctantly parted with 2 of the young beef critters. Almost done, Oliver proclaimed excitedly. He gave the steel pin 2 more hard strikes. That should do it. Basil released his grip on the wheel as Oliver extracted himself from beneath the front axle of the wagon. Did everything look nice and tight under there? Oliver nodded. It was a perfect fit. I rubbed some of that grease on the tip of the pin. Once I got it started, it was no problem at all. It went right into place. Good job, Basil declared, patting the boy on the shoulder. Now, let us go and test it out. We can deliver our weekly load of wood to the bakery. He grinned and winked at the younger boy. Mrs. McGregor always makes her apple fried pies on Tuesday. Let's get that wood loaded, Oliver declared happily. The boys enjoyed their regular deliveries of firewood to the bakery in Guilford. Their little enterprise gave Basil and Oliver the opportunity to earn some extra income and provisions for the family. Plus, each trip always resulted in some special treats. Oliver adored how Mrs. McGregor always rewarded them with a couple of morsels of sweet breads, pies, or biscuits. Basil loved how Miss Ellen McGregor, the baker's handsome, red-haired 13-year-old daughter, always seemed to stare and smile at him. He was smitten by the pretty young girl and eagerly anticipated his weekly deliveries of firewood to her family's business. He would deliver wood on a daily basis, if he could, in order to catch a glimpse of Ellen. The boys tossed their tools and gear into the storage box behind the seat and quickly hooked up the team of horses to the wagon. Within seconds, they were bouncing along the bumpy trail that led to the pile of split firewood behind John's house. They topped a small rise bordered by a large field to the west. It was the Billingsley family's hayfield located in the center of their vast acreage. The sight that greeted them in that hayfield took their breath away. The open ground was filled with hundreds of white tents. Dozens of horses grazed among the high grasses to the north. Large formations of soldiers marched to and fro around the edges of the field. Basil pulled back on the reins and cooed at the horses to stop. "What the devil is going on?" wailed Oliver. "Where did all those soldiers come from?" Basil stared worriedly at the field. "I do not know, but we shall find out." He clucked at the horses and urged them down the hill toward the encampment. About 50 yards from the first cluster of tents, they encountered 4 soldiers manning a checkpoint on the wagon trail. Each of the men were dressed in brightly colored blue and red Continental Army uniforms. 2 of the men blocked the road. The other 2 approached the wagon. "Can I help you, boys?" inquired one of the soldiers. He was young, no more than 18 or 19 years old. "Perhaps," responded Basil, "you can tell me what the devil is going on and why you people are fouling up my family's hayfield." The soldier glanced suspiciously over his shoulder at his compatriots. "This is your family's land?" "That is what I said," responded Basil curtly. "It is my understanding that this land is owned by one of the officers in a local militia regiment, a captain. He is the reason we are encamped here." "A captain? Why, is it James Billingsley?" I could not say, the soldier responded. I never heard his name, only his rank. Basil nodded. It must have been his big brother James. He was the only officer from amongst the militia-serving Billingsley brothers. Basil glanced toward the encampment. Where are you fellows from, Sergeant? I've never seen an actual Continental uniform before. The men seemed impressed that Basil recognized his rank. We're the 1st Virginia Regiment, Captain John Anderson's company, but the men in this field are from all over. Most are from the Carolinas and Virginia. There are a few Marylanders and a handful of stragglers from Delaware. But we are all here for the same reason, to fight the British. We are waiting for the county militias from throughout this region to join us. Is there going to be a fight around here? Questioned Oliver, eyes opened wide with awe. His entire face betrayed his fascination with the military spectacle on display in front of him. I cannot say, young man, the soldier responded, smiling. All I can report is that it will be in your best interest to return to your home, please, for your own safety. I have brothers in the Rowan and Randolph County regiments, Basil declared, ignoring the soldier's polite request for them to leave. Both regiments have men encamped here, the soldier responded flatly. Basil nodded. My other brother, Walter, is with the Virginia Regulars. He was in a fight with the Waxhaws meeting house down in South Carolina. Last we heard, he was in a British prison down in Camden. I'm sorry to hear that, commented the Virginian. He glanced at the ground. Well, gents, I sincerely hate to be rude, but we really do need you to be on your way. We must keep this roadway open for military traffic. Basil sighed and lifted up the reins. Of course, I understand. He was just about to give the leather straps a tug when he heard a familiar voice from the tree line to their left. Basil? Oliver? What are you boys doing here? It was Captain James Billingsley. He was sitting on horseback and leading a squad of 8 mounted soldiers. Basil waved subtly at his brother. Oliver stood up on the wagon seat and waved excitedly. James grinned, turned and said something to his men, and then guided his horse toward Basil's wagon. His men trotted toward the encampment and quickly disappeared into the sea of tents. What is your identity, sir? Inquired the sergeant at the checkpoint. Captain James Billingsley, Rowan County Regiment. You are standing in my field. Your field? The man asked incredulously. Yes, my field. I own it. This is my farm. The sergeant nodded his understanding. And you know these lads? James grinned. Indeed I do. They are my kin. You can let them through, Sergeant. They shall dine with me tonight. Mother will be sick with worry, responded Basil. We should probably go on home. James waved his hand dismissively. Do not worry about that. I will send a runner with the message for Mother. You boys will be in my capable hands. He turned to the sergeant. Make way, Sergeant. As you wish, Captain. The sergeant smiled and waved the boys forward. Enjoy your evening, gentlemen. James turned his horse and headed toward the northern end of the encampment. Basil reached up and tipped his black cocked hat respectfully toward the sergeant. Thank you, sir, and thank you for your service to our nation. The sergeant smiled broadly and gave one of Basil's horses a quick slap on the rump. The animal gave a lurch, and then both horses trotted forward, pulling the empty wagon into the army camp. Basil and Oliver reclined against a log. Each held an empty bowl in his hand. Their bellies were stuffed with hot stew and fresh bread. James sat on a small stool on the opposite side of the campfire and sipped hot tea from a tin tankard. He simultaneously puffed on a short tobacco pipe made of clay. James, do you really think there will be a fight near us? Inquired Basil. His older brother nodded grimly. I have no doubt. General Greene has already selected the ground. It is a crossroad about a mile west of Guilford. He is trying to lure Cornwallis to the location. General Lord Cornwallis? Blurted Oliver. From Charlestown? James took another sip of his steaming tea. He has been out of Charlestown for quite some time now. After he got whipped at the Battle of Cowpens down in South Carolina, he chased our forces all the way to the Dan River. But General Greene managed to give him the slip. Now, Cornwallis is far from his home territory in South Carolina. His men are tired and running low on supplies. They are ripe for the picking. So then Cornwallis is near? Asked Oliver fearfully. James grunted and nodded. He is encamped about 10 miles to the east. Our scouts say that he is heading this way. There was a long moment of silence. Basil finally broke it with a declaration. Well, then, I shall join your regiment immediately, James. Where do I sign, Captain? James puffed his pipe and shook his head vigorously. You will do no such thing. You must take care of our mother. And, besides, I have other matters that require your attention. Like what, supposing? Basil hissed angrily. He did not like for James to tell him what to do, and he certainly did not like for him to forbid him volunteering for the militia. James glanced around to ensure that no one was listening to their conversation. Boys, this valley is going to be crawling with men. I expect that we will have over 4,000 encamped here by tomorrow. The British could have twice as many. So? Asked Basil, confused. So, they are all going to be foraging the countryside for food. Can you imagine 8,000 to 10,000 men and all of them looking for something to eat? Basil suddenly understood. He exclaimed, Our livestock! Yes, responded James. The few livestock we have left are in jeopardy. I have already given a half dozen heifers to the cause, but that was nowhere near enough to meet the needs of this army. The beef lasting only one day. If we are not careful, we could lose our entire herd. I am quite certain that our armies would be honorable and provide reimbursement, but the British most certainly would not. They are desperate. They will take whatever they need. Basil's mind reeled at the thought of losing all their cows. That's over 200 head, James, he exclaimed. He pondered the notion. Surely they will clean out our sheep and goats as well. And chickens, added Oliver. James nodded. And they will empty out every smokehouse, cellar, and corn crib in this region. He spat on the ground. Our people will get mighty hungry before the crops are ready in the fall. If the armies do not simply destroy all the planted fields, Basil added. Exactly, declared James. If the crops are wiped out and the livestock are all slaughtered and eaten, there will be starvation and suffering in the coming winter. We simply cannot allow it to happen to our family. What would you have us do? Asked Basil. You must hide all of our stores and livestock. I suggest you begin at first light tomorrow. He paused and took another sip of tea. The battle will be upon us soon. How soon? Inquired Oliver. 2 days, 3 at most. Oliver's eyes grew wide. He glanced at the village of linen tents that surrounded him. All throughout the encampment, men were eating, smoking their pipes, talking, and laughing. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the sound of a violin playing a mournful tune. There was peace and comfort in the comfortable camp. He could scarcely believe that these relaxed, happy men would soon be called upon to march into battle. Where will we put everything? Inquired Basil. James shrugged his shoulders. All of our stores need to be hidden underground. I suppose you might have to dig out a hide. What about a cave? Asked Oliver. James shook his head. We don't have any caves on our land. I'm talking about the Billingsley land. I'm not talking about the Billingsley land. I'm talking about my cave, Oliver answered excitedly. Sissy and I hid out there for weeks and no one found us. I doubt anyone even knows it is there, except for some Indians, maybe. James glanced at Basil. Where is this cave? About a half-mile west of town, deep in the woods. It's up in a draw near the top of a hill. Oliver is right. I doubt anybody else has ever spotted it before. It is concealed and not near any cabins or houses. The opening is small, barely large enough for a man to squeeze through. I don't even know how Oliver found it. He punched the boy playfully in his shoulder. Is there enough room for storage? Asked James. Oliver nodded convincingly. The entrance is small, and there is a narrow walkway down deeper into the hill, but it opens up into a big room. James raised one eyebrow. How big? At least a 20-foot circle, maybe a little bigger than that. James pondered the boy's description. It definitely sounds like it is large enough. He took a deep breath. I want you boys to work with Henry tomorrow and collect all of the foodstuffs, weapons, powder, anything that an army might take, and haul it by wagon to that cave. It will take a couple of trips, cautioned Basil. As well I know it, exhaled James. Once you are finished with all of the supplies, I want you to hide our livestock. Start with all of our horses and beef cattle. Then work your way down to the sheep, pigs, and goats. Where do we take them? Asked Basil. As far south on our land as you can. Do you remember that little meadow surrounded by the rock walls? Basil nodded. Yes, I have not been there in a couple of years, but it is a perfect spot. There is only one way in and out through that tight little draw. Indeed, James responded, and there is even water there. A spring spills out of the western wall and feeds a small puddle in the rock beneath. It is not much water, but it should suffice for a few days. We can put up a small fence at the mouth of the draw, added Basil. James shook his head. No, put your fence in deeper toward the meadow, but be sure to cut some small saplings and brush to conceal the opening of the draw. Then go back each morning and cut fresh cover for the spot. Make sure everything stays nice and green. Hopefully by week's end, this will all be over and you boys can go and fetch the animals home. Basil smiled at his brother. It is a good plan, James. I know it is, little brother. Now, you and this little chicken thief need to go and get it done. Oliver grinned broadly, and his face flushed red. Basil sat his empty bowl on a rock beside the fire and stood. We will take care of everything, James. You can count on us. He reached out his hand to his brother. James shook his hand and then pulled Basil toward him and gave him a huge hug. Oliver darted toward them and inserted himself into the brotherly embrace. James chuckled with joy at the lad. I know I can count on you, little brother. He released both boys from his embrace. I want you two to take care of Mother and the girls, and be sure to tell Mother that I am thinking of her. We will. Should we tell your wife the same? Basil teased. I shall do that myself. I am going to check on her tonight. He paused and looked sternly at Basil and Oliver. I want you boys to be careful. If you catch sight of any redcoats, just turn and run the other way. Do you understand? Both boys answered, Yes, James. I am very serious. Do not give them any excuse to take you captive. Basil glared solemnly into his brother's eyes. We will do as you say, I promise. Good. Now off with the both of you. Go and get some sleep. We all have a big day ahead of us tomorrow.